So, as before, I've got some notes, this time on my computer screen, and I'm filming from my office. But we'll, again, try to keep this pretty conversational. And welcome to day 2. So, yesterday we took a look at episode 1 of The Good Place and checked out a video on consequentialism. And then my first question to you was, what do you think might justify or explain an action's being worth more or fewer points, positive or negative, according to the point scoring system that we saw yesterday is used to screen people out or include people in The Good Place. So it was really fun to look over the answers. I've chosen 4 students' responses to look at today, and we'll talk through those and see how they fit into some of the ethical theories that we're encountering so far. So Frino, for example, proposed that an action might be selfless, and that might make it worth more points than one that's selfish, which seems to suggest that a person's motivations are what matters. Maybe the same action might be performed for different kinds of reasons, and that might affect its value. So Immanuel Kant, in his Metaphysics of Morals, gives this example of shopkeeping, and he says we can imagine 2 different shopkeepers who perform in some sense the same action, but do so for very different reasons, one of which looks selfish and one doesn't. So shopkeeper A might make correct change for all of their customers because this person is very interested in maintaining the shop's good reputation. If word gets out that you got to stop and count your change on the way out of the shop, people might be less likely to go. And so this looks like a really selfish motivation for making correct change to your customers if you run a shop. We could also imagine somebody else, call them shopkeeper B, who always makes correct change for all of their customers, not because they're sort of thinking about the bottom line, but just out of a basic respect for other people and the belief that everybody deserves to be treated fairly. And that sounds a lot less selfish. So Kant says it seems like, even though to the outside observer these look like the same action, they seem to have very different moral worth, and so we ought to have an ethical theory that takes account of this difference. And Connor, in his comment, offered an interesting variation on this idea, suggesting that perhaps it's not just about whether your action is selfish or unselfish, but actually how big a sacrifice you make in order to determine that action's point value. So if you are a millionaire and you donate $10 to help somebody in need, perhaps that action is worth less than if that same $10 were donated by somebody for whom that was like the last $10 in their bank account. So maybe the size of the impact to the individual making the contribution might be morally significant. And then Derek offered up this really interesting suggestion. He was also sort of taken with this idea that something's being selfish versus selfless might be morally important, but also suggests we might want to look at a person's pattern of behavior over time. So, for example, somebody who consistently does bad things, maybe we should have some kind of a multiplier in play where, like, the fact that this isn't just like you have a bad day and you're tired or distracted or sort of you slip up once in a while, might seem to make each individual bad action seem worse, while somebody who consistently does good things might need some kind of like positive multiplier. So it might seem to be an indication of a good person, not just that you did this one good thing today, but that you have a history of making good decisions, and that if such a person were to occasionally slip up, it seems like maybe even when what they do legitimately counts as wrong, it should be treated less harshly than somebody who's sort of systematically shown a pattern of doing this. On the other hand, some of you argued for a different strategy. So Casey, for example, suggests that perhaps what determines an action's worth should be whether or not it actually benefits somebody else. And I think sort of hidden implication that it maybe we should take harm into account as well. So the idea here would be that your action is good when it effectively helps somebody else and bad when it causes harm, regardless of what you meant. So if I mean well, but I give you something that just isn't useful to you, I haven't done something very good. While on the other hand, if I help you out tremendously, even if I did so for selfish reasons, you might think I've actually done something pretty good that deserves some moral praise. So Casey's view sounds very much in line with the ethical theory known as consequentialism, which is the video we saw yesterday. Spells out that the actual benefit or harm of an action is what determines its moral value. And some of the examples from the show's the orientation video inside the television show actually seem to support this. And I've linked in yesterday's module to a complete transcript of all the points values that show up. But one that stood out to me was you get more points for repairing the tricycle of a child who really likes to ride the tricycle, and you get far fewer points if you repair a tricycle for a kid who doesn't really care about it, doesn't really like riding the tricycle. And as Frina noted, right, this getting into the good place seems to be a matter of a threshold. It's not like it's just the best person who gets in. You actually need to reach what she calls the magic number in order to get in, and that seems to suggest that if the good place is consequentialist, it's a satisficing rather than a maximizing form of consequentialism, because you have to get enough good points, perform enough good actions to cross that threshold in order to get in, and then anything you do above and beyond that is kind of superfluous. Doesn't really seem to matter to whether or not you count as a good person. But that's not all that's going on in this show. We've already seen Chidi is really distressed because he cares about something that's harder to justify on consequentialist grounds. So in the very first episode, Eleanor makes him promise, asks him to promise that he will never betray her and that he'll always stand by her. And then she reveals to him that she doesn't belong in the good place. And then we see that every time she does something bad, something that's kind of comes naturally to her, there are bad consequences for the whole universe of the good place. And so now he's caught, right? He's torn between, on the one hand, keeping a promise, which seems really morally important, and on the other hand, preventing all these disasters, the giant clouds of shrimp and the enormous giraffes running around destroying the world, and the garbage storms and all the rest of it. And this is a really classic ethical conundrum, right? You have to choose between, some people characterize this as choosing between doing what's right and what's good. What seems like you have an obligation to do versus what seems like it leads to the best outcome. And promises are a really classic case where this comes up. Sometimes you make a promise and then you realize that if you broke the promise, you could actually help make the world a better place. And some people think that when you make a promise, you're not saying, I'm going to do this no matter what, but there's some kind of like an escape clause that says something like, I promise I'm going to stand by you unless doing so leads to really terrible consequences. So maybe promises are only moral when they have this kind of escape clause built in, or we should understand promises, at least insofar as they count morally, as having this kind of escape clause. But it seems like that threshold for that escape clause has to be pretty high in order to keep the concept of promising active. So it seems like promising just wouldn't mean anything. For example, when I said I promise to do X for you, I just meant I'm going to do X for you if that happens to be what I had most moral reason to do anyway. So if there's a little bit of a cost to keeping a promise, that doesn't seem like a good reason to break it, at least if we think promises count morally above and beyond just sort of doing what maximizes or satisfies with respect to the best consequences anyway. So promises are tricky. And the seeming moral importance of promises, and the fact that things like lying seem bad even when people do them in order to achieve good ends, that leads some people back around to something like Frina and Connor's original point, that maybe what makes an action morally valuable isn't just the benefit to other people, but your own motivations for performing it, whether you're being selfish or you're acting from a sense of responsibility or obligation or something like that. And there's different ways to fill that out. But if you think that what matters are our motivations or our intentions, that attracts many people to Kant's ethical theory, which Chidi starts Eleanor off with in today's episode and trying to help her to be a better person. And in today's episode, we also see that Eleanor has historically, she hasn't, as she says it, I've never killed anybody. She doesn't have a history of actively going out there and harming other people. But she does have a real problem with taking her obligations seriously. So think of the whole string of times when she manages to duck out of her responsibility to be the designated driver for her group of friends. And she tends to excuse herself by saying, it didn't hurt anybody, or other people are acting bad anyway, while accepting that she's shirked her responsibilities. So all of that motivates some people to take a Kantian approach to ethics, which is spelled out in today's instructional video, and prioritizes your own motivations for action as being what determines an action's moral value, as opposed to the benefits. However, Derek's idea that a person's sort of history or their pattern of action over time is not part of Kant's theory. Both Kant and most modern consequentialists tend to focus on the value of individual action. So each time you go to do something, you're sort of starting from a clean slate. And I think there's something to Derek's idea for a theoretical approach that does look at a person's actions more holistically. For that, we'll have to wait till tomorrow, when we will get to see Aristotle's virtue theory of ethics.